this first block, we've got a series of presentations which broadly revolve around integration and well-being and austerity. And we're going to start with Anna and talking about the immigrant population, the answer to our demographic crisis.
I'm going to show you the results of a paper that deals with immigrant population. Yes, I'm in the correct place. There are interconnections between work packages, and although I was working mainly in work package number 2 and number 3, once you have the data and you estimate data and you have local data, the next question is, what can I do with it? Lots of things can be done with it, including study, for example, of the concentration of immigrant population in different European countries for which we have managed to collect the data. You collect the data and then you do nothing with it. No, millions of possibilities open up. The motivation of this paper is very, very simple. I don't know in the rest of constantly news on the press about how immigrants are going to solve many problems. Press doesn't tend to talk about the consequences of having immigrants from the negative side, but from the positive side, which is very good, by the way. Basically, the news are about they are going to be the one paying for our retirement, and they are young, they will cover labor shortages. And in Spain, we go even further because we have a problem of depopulation on rural areas, a strong one. And we also have an aging problem, strong one, which is shared in many other European countries. And in these other countries where I found this information, the philosophy is always the same. They are gonna be settling down, they're gonna be the answer for these labor shortages, and they are gonna be the answer for so many, many things. And I've included here one piece of news in Spanish that, sorry, you cannot read, but it's so amazing for me because it says something like, how can you make that a person an immigrant goes to live to those areas where the locals are living? If they are living because of a reason. So isn't it a bit naive to think that immigrants are going to exactly go to the places that we nationals are abandoning? Right now, I could finish this presentation because it's already a question and policymakers should ask themselves this, and the answer, of course, is no. They are not locating them to solve our demographic issues. But we have to prove it, right? So here you have a map of the immigrant concentration in different European regions, NUTS 3 level. But as you know, one of the main strong points of the project in general was trying to go deeper in scale. So here you have immigrant concentration at local level for the European countries for which we managed to get the information. Tend to locate in cities as opposed to rural areas. But then when you get statistics data at regional level, you cannot see that. You see that population in Catalonia, for example, increased because of immigrants. Just the fact is just reflecting the big increase of the big cities, mainly Barcelona, and so on. And they aggregate the variable that we have for regional level, or even going far. Are there segregation in cities? They commute longer periods of time and so on and so forth, things that have been studied in the immigration literature. Fine, so this is the motivation. Now I just have to demonstrate what I'm saying, right? Well, this is basically, I've explained all this to you. We are considering the local data that we have. We're going to work with local data. So we want to capture like the different patterns of concentration of immigrants within the regions. So to prove that cities are what matter, we use local data. We managed to do the same analysis. The story was for comparative purposes. We had to have the same data for as many European countries. We managed to get all that data local level for Spain, France, and Italy. We are using a fractional profit model, and the time, unfortunately, we just can't do it for 2011 due to data constrictions. Yeah, when the new censuses and so on will be released in 2021, we can perform this very same exercise again. Well, I'm not going to get into details about the fractional profit model. That's econometrics. It's just what's the probability of an immigrant locating in whatever place, depending on the characteristics of the place. What matters for us is the unit of analysis is the locality. What matters to us is what's so attractive in those places or repellent, so nasty, that immigrants do locate or do not concentrate in those areas. So we have lots of variables regarding the localities, the characteristics of the localities, of course, including size, distance, like unemployment conditions, specialization of the industries, location quotients, and so on. Fine. Variables included. What are we taking into account? Well, first of all, the income, different levels of income, or the income or the well-being acts as an attraction force for immigrants, right? Immigrants tend to concentrate in rich places, in places where there's economic activity. And the opposite could apply for the population at risk of poverty of exclusion, which is the AROPE index. That's the second variable. These two variables at local level exist at the moment thanks to the Imajine project at local level. Otherwise, they just exist at regional level. Then we have unemployment rates at local level. We have the location quotients. We could have chosen any other sector, but we chose the agriculture, the primary sector, because it's also said that immigrants, it's a wish, that immigrants are taking agriculture jobs. So therefore, that's why less control for the economic structure of the area. And then also, our wish was that immigrants were locating in areas with aging population. So we have the percentage of population over 65 plus also the dependency rate. And following also the literature, we want to analyze if the immigrants are locating in places where there's already good quality of labor, human resources, human capital, or on the contrary, they are located in areas where they are competing for the lower skilled jobs, as some other areas of the literature are remarking. Then we, apart from these characteristics, we want to include space into our analysis. We know from economic geography that size of the place matters, agglomeration economies, externalities, and also the distance to the place. It's different being core than being periphery. It's really important, the distance to the city for the immigrants are for economic activity and for probably almost everything that we can think of in economics. Size matters, distance matters, and also to control for the rurality or urbanity of the area. We have population density there. We add some other geographical variables that can act as an attraction for immigrants, for some type of immigration, which is if the municipality, if the area is coastal or non-coastal, especially for certain type of immigrants, because I'm already saying to you right now, one of the shortages of this work that cannot be overcome We're talking about the immigrant population as a whole. There's no data that we can differentiate between immigrants coming from the UK, immigrants coming from other European countries, which is obviously a different motivation than immigrants coming from South America or coming from Africa or coming from some other parts of the world. Unfortunately, if we want to perform this type of studies covering lots of countries, we need homogeneous data, and the only homogeneous data that we have is just immigrants, taking them as a group. That's a shortage. That's a kind of thing that I would love to be able to improve, but it's impossible. So here we have all the variables collected for all these countries, and let's go for the results. Oh, sorry, 2 of them went. Okay, these are the results. We have performed this model for regions, as we would do in normal conditions if not having local data, regions. And then we have performed the same model for localities. You cannot see anything there, and I'm not going to get into details. I'm just going to highlight for you the 3 different hypotheses that we want to contrast, that we want to test, which is immigrants solving first hypothesis, our depopulation problems, right? Are immigrants concentrating in those areas that are depopulating? Are they solving these depopulation problems? Well, the answer is no for Spain, no for Italy, and surprisingly, for France, you can observe that there's a strong concentration of immigrants in certain areas where, by the way, they are depopulating. France, in all these hypotheses that I was testing, seems to have a different pattern and different behavior than countries like Spain and Italy. What is my thinking behind this? My thinking is that France has been traditionally, or for longer, receiving immigrants who have time to resettle and to decide exactly where they want to live or locate, while in Spain and in Italy, the reception of immigrants is relatively a recent phenomena. And so they are responding to completely different factors, different explanations. Immigrant population as the answer for aging population, immigrants locating in those places where, taking care of our old people are needed, which is one of the hypotheses that are around. Once again, we have different results for Spain and Italy where not, like the immigrants are located in dynamic areas with young population that is growing, population that is young. But in France, different results. Third hypothesis, well, immigrant population is going to cover all those jobs that are not covered but by nationals. Agriculture, taking care of the elderly, housekeeping, or any sort of labor shortages in any sector. Well, in Spain and in Italy, that seems to be true, while in France, it is not. Immigrants tend to locate in France in areas that are very deprived and with really high unemployment rates, which, by the way, increases spatial injustice. Final thoughts about this paper. I was just testing 3 hypotheses here for this presentation, but obviously we can go back to the main results and asking ourselves, so what drives the concentration, or what attracts immigrants to concentrate in one part or another? And the result is very well known. The result is previous existence of immigrants in the area and size. Agglomeration economies, cities are what's attracting immigrants to certain locations. But if we run the regressions, if we perform our analysis at regional level, we are not detecting the effect of the city, but the effect of the city and all the rural area around it. I explain myself. In Madrid province, for example, is basically the city of Madrid and very few municipalities that are rural. And there you are, you have one region that is basically the full city of Madrid. Unless we are able to search deeper into detail of what's going on, especially in large regions that contain more than one city, that we can think of many other ones, with different cities, we cannot detect that effect. That effect is completely masked by the regional aggregate. Immigrants are, by the way, the fastest growing population in Europe. We have to pay attention to that, but they are not going to settle down wherever we wanted them. We wish them to settle down. They are almost economicus as well as we are. So if we have moved or we have chosen one place to live, that's going to be almost the same reason why immigrants have chosen or will choose that place to live. So any policy, this is now my opinion, any policy kind of address to force, inverted commas, immigrants to locate in places where we, nationals, are not willing to settle down, are condemned to failure because there's freedom of mobility. There's freedom of mobility all across Europe and of course within countries and within regions. So maybe in the first settlement you offer them cheap housing, government housing, and they stay there. But over a few years, they will just behave in a rational way. How are we going to sort this out? How are we going to solve this concentration problem? That would be the answer. And that would be the final of my presentation. We'll leave questions for the end, I guess.
Yes.
Or yes?
Yes, we'll do. So we'll have 15 minutes for discussion and questions at the end of the session for all the presentations. So thank you, Anna. So the next presentation, Apostolos, who is going to stay with migration, but take a slightly different approach.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to shift the discussion a little bit, staying in the same theme of migration, but I will shift the discussion to a qualitative approach of migration. And the title is provocative in a sense, exploring the nexus between migration and well-being, focusing in rural areas in unequal times. So we take into consideration that inequality is the context, and migration is the result of numerous inequalities. And the issue of, we try to put forward the issue of nexus between migration and well-being is important because this connection between the two entails justice and injustices, just to fuel, that is to feed the discussion which is follows. I will try to be as fast as possible. It is important to have in mind that Greece is a country which has experienced a longest period of crisis. You all know that, and that the economic crisis was very deep at different levels of society, economy, and politics. And this is the context of our discussion, since looking at migration in Greece used to be a hot issue even before the crisis, but even more during the crisis and after the crisis. So the empirical analysis unveils the connections between which are emerging between migrants and refugees on the one hand, and the economy, society, and culture in rural areas on the other, and to try to reflect on the conceptualizations of rurality and well-being between the different population groups living in rural areas. We've argued that while economic migrants move between countries and places in search of employment, refugees are also move away because they are forced, but in the end, both of these moving populations are trying to find a better place for their living. And that's the bottom line for both types of moving populations. There is a well-being approach, on the other hand, which we have tried to make it relevant to our discussion, involved in the discussion. This well-being approach views migration as a strategy for exiting poverty and achieving well-being, and focuses on what people value, their interpretations of well-being, and the various material and non-material factors that contribute to it. Another aspect which is brought on board is that migrants themselves identify as enhancing or constraining on their livelihoods, how they position themselves of well-being compared to other migrant groups, and the way in which well-being is constructed transnationally during the mobility process and over the life course. We have to take these aspects also into consideration. And then a final theoretical underpinning is that the issue of mobility and how mobility and the discussion on mobility is how it highlights, it gives us to understand what is going on in places where people move. And of course, people who move always think and take into considerations the stops, the attractions, and they're also their aspirations. We use the aspect of mobility, which is a complex assemblage of movements, social imaginaries, and experience. So not all of the aspects of mobilities are material, most of them are immaterial. And also another important thing is that the concept of mobility transcends the dichotomy between urban and rural. So it cross-cuts both categories. We've seen, we take into consideration also that we've got different types of population mobility, out migration, of course, in migration, different types of immigration, like counter-urbanization, lifestyle migration, international migration, and also the aspect of people who stay in the rural localities, but also people who move between rural localities. And that's also a discussion in population geography. I've already said that Greece is in the context of economic crisis. I don't want to say much about that, but only to underline the fact that different researches have underlined the fact that during that time of the crisis, at the peak of the crisis, rural areas didn't lose so much of their income, and there were rural areas or rural regions which maintained some sort of level of living, well-being, and this had to do with the agriculture, which has maintained its significance in terms of supporting incomes in rural areas. And that's a finding which comes from different sources. So many rural areas, not rural areas as a whole, but various rural areas proved to be more resilient compared to cities and town suburbs during the years of the crisis. A few words about research methodology. I will say very briefly that we wanted to take into account the different views to rural areas and to well-being in the rural areas. And so we interviewed numerous people, migrants, Romanian migrants in the majority, Syrian refugees, and people who lived in the host rural areas, and other people who are key informants. It is important also to say that this number of 59 qualitative interviews is the number of interviews which were carried out in rural areas, because we had another number of interviews which were carried out in Athens. And we used combined also observation in the research areas, apart from the semi-structured interviews, and we try to triangulate information. That's the study area. It's actually two regional two areas. One is Achaia and the other one is Ilia. Is in the region of Western Greece. We've zoomed into particular area within these two neighboring subregions. And also, as I said, we've interviewed different types of dwellers in rural areas. And going straight to the findings, before we get to some of the conclusions. It's important to differentiate that we've got different angles of looking at well-being. One angle is looking at well-being of rural areas and well-being in rural areas. So these different angles are important to understand what people say, what people narrate when they're asked to state what they think about this area, the area they live or the area they work, which happens to be more or less the same area. So the locals narratives underline more the aspect of the natural beauty, the clean environment and things like that, which make this, their judgment legitimate. Also, the role of natural environment plays an important role in the well-being is more often underlined by those who recently moved to such places, because we had, I forgot to say that we had people who moved, internal movers, people who moved to rural areas, Greeks, Greek nationals who moved to rural areas, and to, especially to this rural area we are dealing with. Also, the majority of those people stated that they moved because of the natural environment. There are some quotes supporting what I am saying. Another aspect of well-being is the economic factors. And in that respect, many of the interviewees stated the fact, especially the locals, stated the fact that although there are material conditions which are important for someone to stay in this rural area, the economic factor is not that favorable. I mean, people have a problem to have this, to lead a working life in rural areas, and rising unemployment and underemployment, so they had to cut back on consumption in the local economy. And this is mostly stated by locals, and it's also recognized by those who moved to those areas, although the people who moved to those areas, in their majority, they moved to those areas because they had faced financial problems in Athens or in other major cities they lived before. Of course, the narratives converge to the fact that working in the primary sector at least allows for people to secure some income, although they might not be a very big income. It is an income on which they can fare, and so this confirms an implicit assumption that agriculture remain as a buffer for many people staying in rural areas, because not all of the people who live in rural areas are employed in agriculture. The newcomers in the wider area, Romanian migrants and internal migrants, and both of them, the newcomers and Romanian migrants, also acknowledge the severe implications of the economic recession for the Greek economy, but also contest what the local entrepreneurs view as limited opportunities, and consider areas to be places of opportunity rather than scarcity. So it's the point of view differs, and this is an interesting finding in our view. So compared to the cities, living in rural areas is more favorable, but not absolutely favorable compared to the options one has in mind. And we have to enter into the picture of the Syrian refugees. We've got the Syrian refugees interviewed because there is a camp just in the area that I mentioned before. It's a camp. It's one of the very limited number of camps are outside the big major cities. And this is a camp in Myrsini, a village, very in a central place in this Western Greece region. And it accommodates between 250 and 300 refugees, the vast majority are Syrians, because the former mayor of the municipality there is of Syrian descent, the only one who is mayor and of a Syrian descent, but Greek citizen as well. So we've interviewed a large number of Syrians who happened to stay in the place, but in a camp. It's an open camp. It's not the camp that one has in mind that is with rigged fences and things like that, but it's an open camp. People can come, go and out, go in and out. So the majority of those people, when they were asked in this very serene rural area how they feel about this area, all of them said, okay, this is a nice place for vacation, but I wouldn't stay here, in short. So even some people, I'm not romanticizing, it's not what people said. Even the very few who had the opportunity or had the option to work in agriculture, they worked there, they found how exploitative are farmers and employers, and they said, okay, we are exploited, we're not going to take that, we're trying to go to another country. But the place is fantastic. So the everyday practice of well-being in rural areas are important. The good life in rural areas, it comes from different groups, is associated with emotions, feelings, and social relations, and that's important aspects of living in rural areas. And for locals, individual well-being in rural areas to the rural place, it relates to the rural place itself, but also combines material and non-material aspects. But these non-material aspects are those who can justify them. Another aspect which is important, and it is more relevant for economic migrants, say Romanians, who happen to be, of course, EU citizens, but for this area, they are economic migrants because they work in the agricultural sector, in the other sectors, but they are economic, so to say, migrants in the area, and they are recognized like that, apart from having the label as EU citizens. So people who have established networks, these networks allow them to construct positive images about places and facilitate their creation of a vision. So a lot of these people, mentioned mostly people who move to this area and economic migrants, are getting to try, in many cases, try to have a kind of belonging in the area. And they say that I like the place, I have a double belonging in some cases also. And before going to the conclusion, I want to say, and according to the majority of the Syrians, as I said already, mentioned the strong similarities between Greece and Syria. Both are Mediterranean countries. And it seems that they perceive various aspects as a landscape, the geomorphology, etc., as similar between the two countries. But they actually adopt the predominant, the main discourse, the dominant discourse, which says that Greece is a country of crisis, so you will not find your future here. You can migrate, and you should migrate, and they migrate. So we have the secondary movements. People get the recognition as refugees or asylum seekers, and after a month or so, they travel with their travel documents and ask for asylum in another country of Europe. This is not permitted, but it's done. To give another aspect. And these, having said that, I'm just going to the conclusions. So the analysis of the qualitative material reveals at least two discourses. One discourse highlights the definitions and aspects of well-being, relates to the characteristics of rural areas themselves as they're assessed by the different population groups. And the second discourse has to do with individual perceptions and practices of well-being in rural areas, referring to the subjective interpretations of well-being, which are linked to emotions, aspirations, hopes, dreams, imaginations, and the sense of belonging to the rural community. Definitely, these two aspects, two main pathways of narratives, are not converging. they converge for some economic migrants and for some internal movers, but not for all. The relationship between perceptions of well-being of and within rural areas is not straightforward. There are conflicting views. And in that point, we can say that more work should be done in order to understand why people move and or settle in rural areas, in specific rural areas. And by the way, this rural area, this wider rural area we refer to is not a deserted area. It's there is intensive agriculture in the area. There's also construction and also tourism in the area. There's no heavy industry, but apart from that, there are employment opportunities for migrants. The locals tend to have a more naturalistic and traditionalistic view of well-being in rural areas, associated with parochialism, as it can be expected when looking at the literature. And the internal migrants share certain views with international migrants as regards their understanding of rural areas as places of opportunity. And that's the important aspect of this discussion, saying that these people can identify themselves potentially not for the whole of the time. No one is never ever sure whether the people will stay there eternally or permanently. It's this snapshot of the specific time that the data were collected. So we cannot have very easily projections. And this is the final slide. So two major intertwined challenges seem to emerge for well-being in rural areas in Greece. First, the challenge of improving the material well-being in rural areas by strengthening and supporting the role of internal and international migrants, and these people who have positive aspirations, etc. And the second is the challenge of creating incentives and empowering newcomers as agents of change that will benefit rural places, and especially those places which are experiencing depopulation and decline. This is a long shot, of course. To address both challenges, the power geometry in rural places needs to be rebalanced in favor of the most dynamic and resourceful elements within them. So there is a gambling there. I'm not saying that in a negative way. There is a challenge there to enable the newly arriving populations to imagine themselves living in rural places, not because they happen to be there, but because there are motivations and incentives to stay there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Apostolos. So we will move on, staying in the broader Mediterranean region, to move on to the next presentation, which Alfredo is going to give us.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to present this. This is an ongoing research, which is a quant research, different from the qualitative research we see, but basically on the same line, probably, about the problem of segregation and how residential distribution of people inhabiting a province. The title, A Spatial Analysis of Residential Segregation in Adriatic Region. Of course, Adriatic is a sea in the Mediterranean basin. So that's why we wanted to focus on that, because problem of migration in the Mediterranean is more recent compared to other countries, and particularly not in Europe. And this glance at the outline. And of course, the motivation, the starting motivation was to try and understand what drives and what is the extent of the uneven distribution at a very local level in the province, in the Mediterranean, when segregation, of course, is seen as the uneven distribution of different groups across the urban space generally. And of course, a vast literature pointed out in time that, of course, a higher level of segregation can lead to problem in integration. And there's a debate upon it, of course, in many ways, but this is something many people think, that higher segregation may lead to problems in integration and more inequality. Of course, this is a quantitative presentation. We refer to an index, which is the Duncan D, which is quite basically index, and which is an index used to understand what is the level of evenness of distribution of residents across a province. Of course, also on this topic, Messi and Denton in paper 1988 pointed out how evenness in terms of distribution is not the same, that the only dimension to be explored, particularly exposure, because exposure is something defined as the probability that you can interact with people from other groups of other ethnicities is important, because it can be seen as a way to integrate the major you're exposed to other groups of ethnicities that you can integrate. What we found when we started to analyze what happens in the province our university is located in, Pescara, was that basically when we refer to residential segregation, we have a study on urban, suburbs, but basically rural areas are a bit forgotten thing, you know. We tend to focus on this residential distribution, how those patterns, particularly in urban areas, and tend to forget what happens in the rural, but they are likely interested by migration, particularly in the Mediterranean. And we found it, especially in our region, which is Abruzzo, that was hit by the earthquake in 2009, and emptied areas tended to be inhabited by migrants who came in and can access house lower prices. So they basically went to the rural areas we were emptied by the locals, something which happened during 2009. And of course, another thing that we want to deal in is the problem of the effects that neighborhood have when the spatial level that we analyze is quite refined. You know, we try to go at a very low level to less than municipality to understand what is the uneven distribution. So we select the city of Pescara and its province, which is part of the Abruzzo region. And of course, this city, which is quite a densely habitated area, offers a practical example of segregation in the Mediterranean. So we want to follow up this line of quantitative research in the Mediterranean. We have a lot of studies about Palermo, Napoli, and Athens, of course. This is a slightly different situation. Higher density, of course, but less inhabitants, and the rural area, which is right at the backyard of the city. And this is the province you see in red. Basically, the province is a valley. There's a river. The city is located nearby the sea. And then you have the rural, the suburbs, which are, you see a highway there to the suburbs. And then you have the rural and the mountains, which right at the back, you know, when you move across the river. And on the other side, you see the quantile map for the people resident in that particular localities, which are foreign born, to study the level of the segregation. And I want to put a slide that what we've learned from Imajine now, this research grounds a little bit on what we try to understand during the project, trying to understand what is the level of spillovers and contagion that happens in territorial dynamics. When we do quantitative research, we need also try and assess the space where people live in. So this was one of the first points. The second point is a problem that we in Quant call basically rural-urban spatial heterogeneity. Here, we can call it the rural-urban divide that we have here. For us, it's a problem of structural differences and heterogeneity, but basically it's try to refer those rural-urban pattern. And the third problem is try to go deeper, as Anna said before, like try to go to a refined level, the maximum we have. So three aims: exploring segregation in the province, try to understand this phenomenon, trying to consider what happens in the surroundings and the rural-urban, and try to give emphasis at the end in conclusion, what is the policy implication for that. Okay, this is a bit of math. Basically, this is an index that can go from 0 to 1, When it's 1, you have like highest segregation. When it's 0, you have like perfect and perfectly even distribution. And this is the exposure. So this is a probability, the probability that you have to interact with people of another ethnicity, okay? Of course, probabilities come from 0 to 1. 1 is the highest probability that you can meet someone. And there is no probability to meet one from the other ethnicity. We also use some complicated, I will say, complicated math for trying to understand what happens in the neighbors. So basically what we do is consider not only the single unit in the indicator, but a local environment, which is sort of a function, then consider what happens in the neighbor. And this is basically the same index in the spatial version. It's quite complicated, you may see, but basically what we have here is the same as before, but we consider also what we have in the neighborhood, in the composition of this is quantity goes from 0 to 1. When it's 1, is completely uneven distribution and perfectly even when it's 0. And the same for the spatial exposure. And we're gonna compare it, the basic version and one we have when we account for the neighbors effect. So we also have a quantile plot here for the different ethnicities we have according to the 2011 census. This data we use for the different European born, so people born in resident in Italy, born in other country from Italy in Europe. It is a wide definition of Europe that includes the whole Balkans. And we have people from Africa and Asia. And you see that quite 3 differences when you turn up the 3 different places. And this is the level of segregation and spatial segregation we have. The D level is the Duncan index, which is 0.966. So this is about 20%, you see there. But what is important here is that the level of spatial segregation, the segregation we have due to what happens in the neighbors. Imagine you want to leave your neighbor, your localities, but you tend to locate there because it's something that other people for your ethnicity locate in your neighbors. It's about 15%. So it's a lot of the general. So what you have is a lot of concentration and patterning around localities due to the interconnection the neighbors have. And this is based on geographical connections. And of course, you also see differences between different ethnicities here. So let's imagine that the overall segregation, which is not very high, is 20%, is slightly lower than other, let's say Athens, Palermo, but it's 80% due to what's happening in your neighbor when you go at very deep spatial scale. And this is the exposure. This is a probability. Of course, the probability to meet an Italian in Italy are quite high. So you see 0.9694 on the first column. But if you go on the other side, you see that, of course, the probability for a European born to meet other African Asia is quite low, and it doesn't change a lot when you consider neighbors, a greater area. So it seems like there are pockets of migrants living. And when you go to a higher scale, this doesn't change a lot. So it's like they're kind of clustered, across the localities. And what we see here, of course, this is the level of the 80% of the overall segregation that is due to the spatial part, which is quite a lot if we consider this spatial patterns. But let's go to the second problems. Try to see what is urban and rural. This is the same province we split in 2. What you see here on the left is the urban area. What you see on the right is the rural area. It's the same province. We just split them in 2. And of course, this is a quantile map to see what is the main phenomenon here. And we did the same exercise basically with the 2 areas split in 2. What you see here is the level of the Duncan D for the urban area and the rural area, the spatial Duncan. Of course, for the urban and rural area. What is interesting here is that the rural area, the level of segregation is higher. So it's about 24%. So this is a piece of information is quite relevant because if we would have considered together the province, you would have seen like the level of segregation is like 20%. When you go to the rural part is 24%. So they're kind of more segregated. and which is in the urban area is about 17%. But what is important, another point is that when you consider the rural area, the spatial part is about 75% of the overall segregation. When you consider the urban area, it's true that you have a low level of segregation, but the ratio is quite higher. So you have that urban settlement have lower segregation, but the spatial dimensions is more relevant. And this is something it could be expected because in the urban settlement, you have a lot of connection. So in the urban area, in the rural area, you tend to have pockets more segregated in a small pockets around for different ethnicities, but you have less relevance of the spatial dependence of what happens in the neighbors. So it's like two different phenomena. You have a lot of neighborhood components in the urban side, which is slightly lower segregation, and you have a lot of segregation in the rural area, but it's less due to the spatial part for the for what happened in the neighborhood. And this is a third exercise just to show what is the modifiable areal unit problem. So we did the same at the municipality level. So trying to see that when you trickle a little bit with the spatial scales, you have changing in the results. And this is something you have to consider and try to, as I said before, deeper as you can at the local level. So just some policy implication about what we said before. We see that spatial patterns have a great impact on the general level of segregation. So if you receive money from the central government, because central government gives the money for coping with this kind of problems, but it's the local government that has to cope and to act with that. So when you have received money at this province or regional level, you have to consider a little bit that when you try to act, you have those neighborhoods effect that put some problems. When you put money on that, you have to consider the sort of spillovers that you have to take into account before deciding what the amount of money for the single municipality, which is in the province. The second problem is the kind of action you expect in the rural and the urban area. So we saw that particularly in the urban area, there's a lot of neighborhoods effect, spillovers. So you probably want to have a policy which as an integrated sign the urban settlements. So maybe urban policies that get a higher level of exposure so that people can integrate, something can improve probably the level of segregation in the city. Probably in the rural area, you need something like subsidies that try to cope with single municipalities, small town, detached houses, rural empty places like rural towns nearby the mountains that can boost a little bit level of economy, maybe try to reignite the economic level in the rural area. And the last point is that the result seems to justify a critique that was brought in by Lichter in the study of segregation, that concentrating the study of segregation on the urban area is something we are keen to do. I mean, we think of segregation as something which is particularly urban thing, but especially Mediterranean, due to the life cycle of urban settlements of region, you expect that to happen in the rural, in the emptied areas, and seems to be in line with the other results of other presentations that we had this afternoon. And of course, a last point that all these implications that we have at the policy level could be a basis to study the problem of house access using data that can come from digital web scraping about the house prices that are really important in terms of what happens in segregation at local level. And thanks you all. See you in the next project.
Thank you. So then a final presentation session from Margarita.
Good afternoon. Sorry, you have to listen to me as well before going for a coffee. I will try to be relatively brief. This is a presentation of some additional deliverable for Imagine that hasn't been presented as yet, and deals with the issue of regional effects of fiscal adjustment and austerity programs. So, okay. So basically the global financial crisis brought back the whole issue of fiscal policy and how fiscal policy will affect output. So basically the discussion about the fiscal multiplier. So many after actually at the end of around the end of, let's say, the financial crisis and the beginning of a Eurozone debt crisis, many countries in the OECD decided to adopt austerity policies. And it may come to a surprise to many of you, basically to the non-economists, to find out that before the global financial crisis, basically fiscal consolidation was considered to be expansionary. So in a standard macro textbook, this is what we were telling the students, that fiscal consolidation will actually may lead to an increase in output and not a decrease in output. And the argument was the following, that first of all, fiscal consolidation should take the form of a spending cut, because a spending cut will reduce output less than an increase in taxes. So if you manage to do that, have a spending cut fiscal consolidation, there will be a demand effect. So demand will go down, but at the same time, you may have a stimulus of demand from monetary policy, and you may also have positive supply side effects that may come from structural reforms. So these supply side effects, together with some accommodation from the monetary policy, may actually restrict the output loss from fiscal consolidation and may even imply a rise in output. And this rise in output may be considerable if one takes into account that in some countries, it may occur what we call as a regime switch. So if you have, let's say, a country that suffers from fiscal consolidation problem and fiscal policy is not considered to be sustainable, implying a fiscal austerity measure may change expectations and may increase investment and consumption in the future. So basically, this was the story that it became after the debt crisis in Eurozone and after the debt crisis in Greece, it became more and more difficult to explain to Greek students. When we had, let's say, youth unemployment rate of 60%, it was very difficult to sell this story. And in fact, this story was gradually abandoned because although the economic adjustment programs of the IMF and the European Commission for some countries, including Greece, were based on a fiscal multiplier of 0.5%. This basically would mean that for 1% cut in spending or rise in taxation, what you would have was a loss in output of 0.5%. So you would have a fiscal multiplier lower than 1. So it's a very low fiscal multiplier. And this was the assumption according to which the economic adjustment programs were designed. But if you, and some of you probably remember, what actually happened was that the growth projections were revised every year after year, because they were always seemed to be more optimistic than what actually did happen in those countries. So in fact, there was a lot of research at the time, and Blanche Sareli, this was like a famous paper that actually claimed that the fiscal multiplier at the time was not 0.5%, but was 1.5%. And this is why the recession was much bigger than it was initially predicted. And then at that time, a big discussion started about the asymmetric effect of fiscal austerity in slums and booms. So the idea was that fiscal multipliers are considerably larger in a slum than in a boom. So fiscal multipliers were higher during booms of during the economic slack, which was the case in the beginning of 2010. But even so, there hasn't been much work, on the impact of these fiscal austerity programs on regional output and on inequality, and inequality in general. There are some studies that look at the impact of fiscal austerity program on inequality, but not on regional inequality. So, some evidence indicate that fiscal adjustment episodes tend to increase income inequality, but as I said before, basically due to the lack of appropriate data, I'll come back to this in a minute, most work has been done at the national level. So the existing literature so far is relatively silent as to these effects are evenly distributed within a country. So even in the case, so what are the main questions? But even the cases where the fiscal multiplier is low and fiscal austerity is detrimental for national incomes and income inequality, we still have the question about what type of austerity is less detrimental. And moreover, how are these effects distributed geographically within the same country? What are the regional effects and what are the effects on regional inequality? Are regional effects of austerity programs larger? Does cross-regional inequality increases? And how does it compare with countrywide inequality? So these are, we will partly try to answer some of these questions. So what we aim to do is to provide some novel evidence on how fiscal adjustment affected regional income and cross-regional income distribution. So we employ, unfortunately, country-level data, because as Anna mentioned before, we can't really get micro data in order to investigate this issue, because EU SILC does have income data, but it doesn't have, we cannot infer the region from this. So basically what we would really need is what Anna's group did, but not only for 2009, we would actually like to have this for more years and for the new, that it would be extremely useful. But so this unfortunately doesn't exist. So basically what we look at is the effect on regional income inequality of multi-year fiscal plans. We look at multi-year fiscal plans rather than year-by-year shift in fiscal variables. We have a data set that defines this multi-year fiscal plans in a specific way, and this is whether a country X in a year T has implemented a new austerity plan, So this is the data set of Alessina et al. It's quite famous. So what do we look at? We look on what is called a dynamic average treatment effect. So it's basically a kind of diff in diff technique. So diff in diff technique, for someone who is not an econometrician, probably I should say a few things. This comes basically from medicine. So you have a medicine and you have a treatment group, a group that is treated, and you have a group that is not treated, the control group, and basically you find the average treatment effect. So what is the average treatment effect of the medicine on the group that has been treated? So basically what the medicine here is the fiscal austerity. So we have different regions. We have the regions, the treated regions, which are the regions that have been subject to a fiscal austerity program, and we have the control region. So we try to look at the average, the dynamic average treatment effect. We look at the cumulative output loss in 5 years from the implementation of the austerity program. So basically, with the technique we use, I'm not going to talk about the details, a bit different in what sense? that here we don't have an exogenous effect. So a fiscal austerity program is something that is decided by the country. So it's not like an exogenous shock. So we have to use a methodology that is a bit different in order to account for that. So basically what we do beforehand is to estimate a propensity score, which is the probability that a fiscal austerity plan will happen in the specific country. So this changes a bit things, but anyway, this is just the methodology. Okay, so we estimate the causal effect of fiscal adjustment on regional output at an age horizon, but as I said before, it's 5 years. And we obviously control for some other variables that will affect regional output. And I state these variables here is regional GDP growth rate, the regional inflation rate, the regional output gap, etc. And we use 2 different assumptions regarding the way these variables affect the treated and the untreated countries. I will explain this in a minute. So we have the restricted model, and when we say restricted model, we mean that all these control variables affect treated and untreated and controlled countries exactly in the same way. So the treatment, the fact that you have a fiscal consolidation does not affect the way all other variables impact on regional income. This is the one assumption. And the other assumption is that it does, that the treatment not only affect also indirectly regional output through the impact of all these other variables. So we have the restricted and the unrestricted model. Our estimation period is 2009 to 2014. To 2014, and the dependent variable initially is the cumulative change in regional GDP relative to the period before the treatment. So an extra, we have estimated the average treatment effect for all regions, but what we did as a second step is to split our data to booms and slumps, depending on whether the national output is above or below trend. So what we find is that in a boom, a fiscal consolidation has an average very small negative and short-lived effect. I will show you some results in a minute. Whereas in a slump, the results are about 1.5 times higher and highly statistically significant. Let me give you an example. What do I report here? Here you see for all, the first part of the table is OECD, and the second part of the table is Eurozone countries. So to give you an example, let's go to the last column and the last row, that is the highlighted one, the minus 6.081. What does this mean? This means that 1% of fiscal consolidation, 1% cut in spending, or 1% increase in revenue will lead to an accumulated loss in output after 4 years, after 5 years, of minus 6%, more or less 6%. So this is the accumulated loss in the regional output in a slump, because this last row is in a slump. You can see that in a boom, which is the line above, this effect, it's smaller, but most importantly, is insignificant. You need to have a star to have a statistical significant effect. So basically, we get that the effect of fiscal consolidation differs between a slump and a boom in the following way. In a boom, it's short-lived in some cases that exist. You can see here the stars. In some cases, it's where h equals 0 and h equals 1, like in the first row, the first 2 numbers, but it's short-lived and it's much smaller. The next thing we take into account is the structure of the economy of the specific region. So we divide regions according to their share, to the share of in the gross value added of industry, agricultural activity, and construction. Okay, so this results, I think there are relatively interesting. So in the first panel, we have the first part, high share of agriculture. So we have the regions where agriculture has a big share in the gross value added, and the regions in which agriculture has a low share in the gross value added of the region. And if we see the sum, the cumulative effect on the output loss, we can see that it is much higher, it's minus almost 7% in the regions with a high share of agriculture and lower in the regions with a low share of agriculture. If we look at the construction, which is panel B, we will see a more or less similar picture. So the output loss, the accumulated output loss is minus 6.8 in the regions with a high share of construction, and relatively lower, minus 5.2% in the regions with a low share of construction. If we now look at the industry share, the result is reversed. We can see that the output loss is much larger in the regions with a low share of industry. In those regions, the output loss is minus 6.3%, whereas in the regions with a high share of industry is relatively smaller. In fact, we can say here that the lower output loss is in the regions with a high share of industry. So high share of industry is probably this result indicates that the high share of industry, it's a way of limiting the negative effect of fiscal austerity on output. If here we look at the Eurozone, so the difference is that the difference between the results basically reflect the common monetary policy. So we have here the regions that at the same time have a common monetary policy, but as I said before, can somehow accommodate the impact of fiscal consolidation. And the picture is more or less the same. In fact, the difference between the high share of industry and the low share of industry, it's even stronger in the case of Eurozone. Right, so turning now to regional inequality, the dependent variable is the cumulative change in inequality relative to the period before the austerity program. And again, here we control for other variables that affect inequality, such as the human capital index, inflation rate, unemployment rate. There is a literature that trade openness affects inequality, and we also include the crisis dummy. So we measure inequality with different indexes. You can see them here. And here the overall picture indicates that the impact of fiscal austerity on regional inequality is short-lived. So we don't see, apart from the case of the Palma ratio, we don't see the stars after h equals 1. We see that in latter periods, we see the impact of fiscal austerity on inequality to gradually disappear. And if we now look only at the Eurozone, we will see that the effect almost vanishes here. So we have a cross-regional inequality to be only momentarily affected by fiscal austerity programs. The effect does not persist for horizons beyond the 2 years after the initiation of the fiscal consolidation program. So we do find some effect of fiscal consolidation on inequality. In the full sample of OECD economies, it increases between 0.86 and 7.9%. But it's rarely significant at horizons beyond the 2 years. In fact, the effects of fiscal adjustment programs on Eurozone cross-regional inequality almost are close to 0. They are significant only for the Gini coefficient, 1 year ahead with only when we have the unrestricted model. So in order to summarize the main findings, we find that the accumulated output loss is estimated to be about minus 5% for OECD countries. And this effect is slightly smaller for EU countries and completely insignificant for Euro area countries. This is something that I didn't report, so you didn't see this table. Basically, you saw the next table where we differentiate between booms and slumps. And here we get a more gloomy picture because the average treatment effect in recession, it's relatively strong, and it varies between minus 5.9% for OECD countries and minus 6.8% for EU 27 countries, and which is much larger than that similar estimates in the literature. So the effects of a consolidation program are also found to be larger. The higher is the share of gross value added of agriculture or construction, whereas the reduced output growth less for regions with higher share of industrial production. A policy implication here would be to accompany a fiscal austerity program with some sort of fiscal transfer from regions with a low share of industry, with a high share of industry to regions with the low share of industry, because it seems that regions with low share of industry are having a much higher loss than from a national fiscal austerity program, and probably some compensation here should be provided. So on cross-regional inequality, we find an increase between 2.2 and 7.9, 3 years after the implementation of the program, when considered all OECD economies. When looking at the EU economies, which is something I didn't report, I report only the OECD and the Eurozone, we do find an effect, but again, it's smaller than in the case of all OECD countries. It's between 2.7 and 5.8%. But finally, looking at the Eurozone economies, the effect vanishes. So why could this be the case? Let me just very briefly comment on that. Why don't we get an effect on regional inequality from fiscal austerity programs? One possibility would be that we have a fiscal consolidation program that works through a rise in taxation. And this rise in taxation could somehow compensate for a rise in inequality. Another possibility, obviously, is that the inequality measure we used is basically not the actual inequality, but a proxy for cross-region inequality, because we don't use micro-level data, as I explained at the beginning. So the way we construct the data, we use the very strong assumption that inequality within region is basically, that income basically within its region is the same. So everyone is having, it's like assume that everyone is having the same income. So basically, this is a strong limitation. So, however, we do believe that even so, or even with those limitations, these estimates provide a fresh look at what happens in regional inequality within countries following the austerity programs that have largely been implemented in that period in the OECD countries. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. We've overrun, and I'm keen to make sure that we finish the end of the day in time. So what I'm going to suggest is that if people in the room have questions for speakers in this last session, you ask them over tea and coffee, which we'll have now. But there is one question online for Apostolos, so I shall ask that question. That's actually two questions from the same person. Firstly, to what extent did newcomers' gender and family status, lifestyle, to what extent did newcomers' gender, family status, life stage and their reception by host companies shape their subjective well-being experiences. So I suppose, yeah, to what extent was their subjective feeling of well-being influenced by their gender and family and life stage? And the second part of the question was that you suggested creating incentives to encourage, to attract newcomers to rural areas. And they ask, what role does addressing employment conditions in the horticulture sector have as part of that?
Okay. Okay, thank you for both questions. I think it's important to, this is blank. Sorry for that. It's gone? Okay. Okay. I think the lifestyle migration, in our case, in the part of the interviewees, were not well off. The internal movers partly moved because they sought another way of living in rural areas, but not merely. It was a combination of people who moved for economic reasons. They couldn't cope in urban areas, so they moved to rural areas, but where they had some kind of property there, so they could secure the resources of living there, and they could also seek for additional employment and not have the difficult condition of living in Athens. I will going to reply, and then Loukia can also add some things probably. And the other question is, yes, exactly that. We are suggesting that there should be a set of initiatives, not quantitative initiatives. I mean, probably organized at the local level and the regional level, not I mean, national level initiatives. These do not operate anymore. We know that there are initiatives like that, but being initiatives to balance way of living in rural areas, the balance of life, and also some important employment opportunities, either in agriculture or combining agriculture with other employment. You want to say something?
Yes, if I may, just a comment about the issue of life stage and its connection with well-being. What we saw during the interviews is that particularly women, but also men, tend to stress a better quality of life connected with the ability of their children to have a different life away from the cities. But also they stress that in order to have this kind of better quality of life in rural areas for their children and for the better life, to have better infrastructures in terms of schools, in terms of hospitals, in terms of different other abilities to live well there.
Good. Thank you for those answers to the online audience.